Hello, happy Tuesday. We are back. My name is Lisa. I'm a NICU nurse educator and an experienced NICU nurse. I was on vacation last week, as you may know, but I'm back with another Teach Me Tuesday with a topic broken down actually into two small parts because in typical Lisa fashion, I tried to make thermoregulation into one Teach Me Tuesday. And honestly, it's just too much because, as you well know, thermoregulation is a huge part of the work we do as NICU nurses day in and day out, from admissions to taking care of critical babies to weaning to cribs, discharging, preparing parents for discharge. There is so much that happens with thermoregulation. So here is part one of two. It's just two parts. So we'll cover Tuesday this week and then next Tuesday as well. So let's dive in. Thermoregulation really is like the thing that we're doing every single day, and every single baby in the NICU is getting their temperature taken every day regardless. And I have posted a video kind of in joking about this before, but like when you go and take a baby's temperature, they do think it's the worst thing that's ever happened to them, so God love them. But as we know, we're doing it for every baby that comes into the NICU, often at minimum 4 times a day, two per shift. So 4 times in a 24-hour period if your baby is like maybe Q-shift vitals or something, but much more frequently when the babies are smaller, especially in the ELBW population because they're at high risk for heat loss due to their immature skin, which we know is basically translucent and transparent and has very little fat stores. This mild stress of coldness, of trying to rewarm, actually can increase their risks of mortality and morbidity. So it is our job in the NICU of keeping them in a neutral thermal environment, right? An NTE, while also promoting holding, kangaroo care, growth, fluid balance, etc. So let's talk about it. Cold stress is what we're trying to avoid at all costs, right? Babies that get cold stress, like I mentioned, have an increase in their morbidities and mortalities. This is shown in the evidence over and over again. A cold baby is in a dangerous position. Cold stress occurs when a baby uses extra energy to stay warm, often becoming hypothermic. Their oxygen consumption increases, their glucose consumption increases, so their stores are depleted. They may develop metabolic acidosis. You may see cold extremities, mottled skin, tachypnea, and hypoglycemia. This can lead to increase in their respiratory distress that they may already have at baseline, acidosis, and of course, those poor neurodevelopmental outcomes I was talking about. Cold babies are at higher risk for death as well. So prevention is far easier than treatment. And why are these ELBW babies so specifically vulnerable? Well, they have a large surface area relative to body mass. And I know that's just crazy to think about. Like, a little 500 grammer has a large surface area, but they do. There is a lot of surface area, but without a lot of weight to them, as we well know. Thin, immature, gelatinous skin with poor barrier function and high water loss, right? So they have this insatiable water loss that's going on, and then they don't have anything to really keep them warm, whether that's a barrier or their brown fat or subcutaneous fat stores. And then poor vasomotor control and inability to shiver. So they're not good at being like, hey, I'm going to come in and bring everything in. Like when I'm cold, I'm like, okay, like let's bring everything to the middle, bring my hands in. They don't know to do that. So these infants can become hypothermic very quickly. It's why we use heat shields in the incubators. It's why we try not to pop the top. And we just really try to keep them in from the delivery room on really warm. Because we know that there's 4 ways that babies can lose heat: evaporation, conduction, convection, and radiation. So evaporation is that water loss through their skin, amniotic fluid, other fluids, etc. Conduction is when the infant lies on a cold surface like the scale, like a not pre-warmed incubator or pre-warmed warmer. This is why I stress when you are the admit nurse, it is your job to make sure you have a radiant warmer pre-warming, or if you're going to have an ELBW infant, they'll be coming from labor and delivery in a pre-warmed incubator. Something else just to think about, always knowing kind of what are they going to be admitted on and is it pre-warmed. Convection is the loss of heat from the newborn skin to surrounding area from portholes, drafts, room temperature going around them. So really trying to keep a warm room temperature, especially the babies out to hold. We want to get these babies out holding skin to skin. But even in those moments, this is why we talk about the standing transfers, so we're not like soaring babies through the sky, which I do. I know I do because C-section moms, I've had a C-section, they're not always able to do these standing transfers. So even if you're soaring them, keeping them contained, blankets, etc., just so they're not exposed to that draft. And then radiation is when heat moves from the baby to nearby colder objects like a window or wall. I think we're pretty good about it, not putting them by those cold surfaces anymore. I would say radiation is probably the one that we are least concerned about. I'm not saying we're not concerned about it, but it doesn't seem to happen as often now that we know more. And so keeping all that in mind, this is also why we use humidity. So humidity helps with heat and fluid balance, especially in the first, 14 days in our ELBW infants. I will come back and remind you that this is an opportunity for you to pause and think about what your policy and procedure is. If you don't have one, you should be part of a team that's writing it. If it seems really broad, recently I've been talking about skin to skin and when you should do skin to skin on social media. And there's a unit that they don't do skin to skin until the humidity is off at day 14, which feels like a lot. I'm just going to say that. So, just things to think about. Some units start at 70%, some start at 80, some start at 90. Is there amazing evidence? I don't know. I'm not sure I can tell you. I think there's one concrete way to do it all the time, but I do think infants that are born less than 31 weeks, less than 1,500 grams, should be getting humidity for at least 14 days, maybe in that 70 to 80 range for the first 7, and then around 50% for the next 7. And then obviously want to minimize the portholes, making sure I have a picture of an incubator here, making sure that what you're set at. So this incubator is set at 50% and it's reading 40%. So to me, that tells me, hey, were my portholes open? Was my side down? Was my top popped? And was my water running low? This is something you should be paying attention to and documenting because you are affecting their thermal environment. And so we should be documenting this at all times. So that brings us to our incubator and radiant warmers. I would say this is in the top 3 most common things I'm asked about. PIVs is a huge one. This thermoregulation, understanding servo versus skin mode versus or servo skin mode versus air mode, incubators, radiant warmers is probably number 2. And then number 3 has to do with like kind of the care of the ELBW infant. But that being said, this might seem back to basics, but let's go back to the basics because the basics is where we should live until we understand it, right? So incubators provide that thermoneutral environment to tailor to each baby's need. They help reduce all 4 types of heat loss. They control the air temperature. They're allowing the skin or air temperature to regulate depending on what mode you're set in, which we will go into, preventing drafts and radiation loss, and reducing evaporative loss by using humidity. So proper incubator management and understanding what you're seeing and what you should be seeing is key to the care of these babies. We also have radiant warmers, which are primarily used during resuscitation, admission of 31 and plus week infants, late preterm infants, term infants, procedures. They provide a heat source. They provide open access, but you can have radiant heat loss and you have an increase in your evaporative heat loss. So they're not going to quite help as much with all 4 of those. I love a good radiant warmer. I think if we could admit those babies that are 2 to 2.5 kilos on them and then transition them to a crib or an older style incubator that we might not need as like our fancy big incubators for, I do think that having them on a radiant warmer to the parents makes them appear more accessible, which I love. So let's talk about the difference in the incubator in that servo mode versus air mode. So I'm going to explain this the best that I know how. So skin mode, which sometimes is called servo mode, sometimes is called baby mode. You'll see I have it circled here on this example of an incubator. I have another example on the next slide in the middle where this baby is in baby mode. The patient I'm taking care of today is on skin mode, servo mode, baby mode, whatever you want to call it. It adjusts the incubator temperature based on the baby's skin temperature. So servo mode is preferred for our ELBW babies pretty much until they get to about 12 to 1,500 grams or considering weaning to a crib. It's not great once we start dressing them because of the way the probe works. So just kind of think about if I'm dressing you, we probably should be off of this. You will be monitoring and documenting 3 temperatures: the baby's temperature, the set temperature, what you want the baby to be, and how much air temperature it's taking for the baby to be that set temperature. So this is what I'm going to tell you. In your house, you set your air conditioning, your heater, whatever, to be 70 degrees. That's air mode. I, as a adult woman, if I'm cold, I go put a sweatshirt on. If I'm hot, I take that sweatshirt off. I put on a tank top, whatever it is. I can do that because I can speak. I can do that for myself. I have someone to help me, etc. Babies can't do that. So that's why they need servo mode, because it's continuously monitoring the temperature and then adjusting the incubator to keep them there. The reason that you have to document this hourly is because, according to our standards and our guidelines, we are adjusting their environment and their temperature. And so that's something that has to be documented every 1 hour in an ICU setting, according to JACO. So, something to think about if you're not already doing that. Furthermore, if your air temperature is fluctuating a lot, so let's say every time you have charted today, you've written down that your baby is 37.0, 37.0, 37.0, and you're like, nailing it. But your incubator temperature has gone everywhere from 31 to 37 to keep that baby there. I would actually say your baby hasn't had the best day. You really want that air temperature to be around, within a degree or two of itself, depending on your care times, because it shouldn't be having to work that hard. And specifically, I will say, is if your incubator temperature is about 32 consistently, let's just say for a number, and now it's having to take 35, to me, that's saying the baby got cold. And the incubator really had to warm up 3 whole degrees to get the baby warm. That could be masking cold stress. It could be masking that they're sick, because remember, premature babies are much more likely to be cold when they're sick than to have a fever. Alternatively, it could do the opposite, right? If the temperature is rapidly dropping, it could be because the baby has a fever. It could be because you overnested them. Guilty? Anyone else guilty of overnesting? So it is something to pay attention to, what the air temperature is doing when your baby's on skin servo mode. So that brings us to air mode. Air mode in an incubator maintains a constant air temperature, right? So you can see that it's highlighted here that the baby's in air mode. It's set at 35 and it's currently reading 34.1. It maintains a constant air temp regardless of the baby's temperature. It requires us to still use some external monitoring of the temp. Some people still leave the servo probe on to kind of see what the baby's doing. Some are just doing it with our thermometer. It's great to use during weaning with our stable infants, but we still want to keep their baby's temperature between that kind of 36.5, 36.7 to 37, 37.2, right? That tight range that we want them to be in. But I'll remind you, what I think happens often is we'll put the incubator in air mode while that baby's out doing skin to skin, right? So it doesn't alarm at us. Then we forget to switch it back when they go back in. And then all of a sudden, the baby's just been in this 34-degree temperature incubator and they're not warm. And so it is our job to be documenting this hourly so we can be paying attention to it. So just something to think about, especially move them in and out. And then on our open incubators or a radiant warmer, we can also do something called manual mode, where you're giving it a percentage of power. Depending on your radiant warmer, you can also put them on skim mode, servo mode, baby mode, where it will adjust the power itself to keep the baby there. I think it's harder, especially on admissions in radiant warmers, because the skin probe doesn't stick as well. So just something to think about, but you can manually adjust it. This is what you're also doing to pre-warm your bed before the admission, like we talked about. But it is an option, especially if you're doing a procedure or the probe's not sticking on well, that you can manually adjust it. So you're setting a percentage amount of heat to keep the infant at that desired temperature. And those are the main modes of warmth, heat in our incubators. So some troubleshooting tips for servo mode: you must ensure that they have good probe placement. It must be covered and secure with that gold sticker, gold heart, whatever you're putting on there. Use tight alarm limits to catch temperature drifts. I think after procedures, sometimes when we close the top down, the baby can get really warm because we're like suddenly in this environment as the humidity kicks in. In air mode, remember, it does not respond to the baby's condition. So the baby could be cold or hot and the incubator will not change. So the air mode is not going to adjust it. It's not ideal for our very preterm or unstable babies. Even those kids that are in shock, this would not be good for, because they're not regulating their temperature at all on their own. And so we really need to help them. Our neuro babies, that's another great example of that really needs skin servo mode. The baby feels cold, but the incubator temp looks okay, we got to be checking it, right? Always do an equipment double check too. I always am like tracing my lines, making sure everything's working well together. This is just a little graph I kind of threw together to really just hone it in on what skin servo mode is versus air mode. And I bring this back up just to remind you of what we're documenting hourly and the fact that we really need to understand what mode they're on so that we can catch those minute changes. As you know or may know, I am going to be hosting 2 webinars this month. One of them is next week on a Friday, and the webinar is about assessment and why we as NICU nurses need to be looking for these small changes. And temperature is one of them. Really, on that skin servo mode, noticing the changes in your air temperature is so key, and it can tell you very early that something is going on with your patient. So target temperature is still there. Who it's best for, advantages and disadvantages. Pause me, screenshot this. I will also have this as a resource on my website. So you can go check out my website at NICUlearningnest.com and find all of my free resources available for you there. So that was part one. We've already at 16 minutes. So you can tell that if I tried to put part two together, we would have been here all day. So proud of me for making it into 2 parts. But we know how essential this is. That's why we're going to keep going a little bit more in depth, do a little bit more case study in our next video next week. We're going to talk more about parent education, more about kangaroo, and then incubator weaning when a baby's ready, when they should go to a crib, and temperature troubleshooting. Also, be sure to check out my critical moments that we post every week that go along with this week's Teach Me Tuesday. And of course, you can find me on all the socials, TikTok, Instagram, at the similar handle, NICUeducator.Lisa. And if you need anything from me, please let me know. This topic came from you. I thank you. And I will see you next week for another Teach Me Tuesday.